The Argentine railway network consisted of a 47,000 kilometers network at the end of the Second World War and was, in its time, one of the most extensive and prosperous in the world. However, with the increase in highway construction, there followed a sharp decline in railway profitability, leading to the breakup in 1993 of Ferrocarriles Argentinos, the state railroad corporation. During the period following privatization, private and provincial railway companies were created and resurrected some of the major passenger routes that FA once operated. Dissatisfied with the private management of the railways beginning in 2012 and following the once tragedy, the national government started to re-nationalise some of the private operators and ceased to renew the contracts. At the same time, Operadora Ferroviaria Sociedad del Estado was formed to manage the lines which were gradually taken over by the government in this period, and Argentina's railways began receiving far greater investment than in previous decades. In 2014, the government also began replacing the long-distance rolling stock and rails and ultimately put forward a proposal in 2015 which revived Ferrocarriles Argentinos as Nuevo Ferrocarriles Argentinos later that year. The railroad network today, with its 36,966 kilometers size, is now somewhat smaller than it once was, though still the eighth largest in the world. History. The growth and decline of the Argentine railways are tied heavily with the history of the country as a whole, reflecting its economic and political situation at numerous points in history, reaching its high point when Argentina ranked among the 10 largest economies in the world during the country's Belle Epoque and subsequently deteriorating along with the hopes of the prosperity it came so close to achieving. In the early years, the railway was emblematic of the vast waves of European immigration into the country, with many coming to work on and operate the railways, such as the Italian Argentine Alfonso Covassi, the country's first engine driver, and also in the sense that the population boom experienced as a result of this immigration required means of transportation to meet growing demands. Much like in the American West, the railways also played a key role in the creation and expansion of new population centers and boom towns in remote parts of the country. Development. The importance of foreign capital in the construction of the Argentine railways is perhaps overstated, with initial construction of the network beginning in 1855 at first with Argentine finance, which continued throughout the network's development. The Buenos Aires Western, Great Western and Great Southern Railways were all commenced using Argentine capital, with the Buenos Aires Western Railway being the first to open its doors in the country, along with its Del Parque railway station. Following the adoption of liberal economic policies by President Bartolomé Mitre, these railways were sold off to foreign private interests, consisting of mostly British companies, in what would be the first of many acts where the ideological climate of the time would define the fate of the Argentine railways. These sales also included Argentina's first railway, the Buenos Aires Western, which was sold in 1890 to the British company New Western Railway of Buenos Aires for just over £8.1 million. This sale, and others that came after it, was heavily criticised at the time for being far lower than the actual value of the railway, and prompted many anti-British protests. In later years, this was also criticized by historians. During the 27 years in which it belonged to the government of the province of Buenos Aires, the Western Railway was the line which was most luxurious, least wasteful, and offered the most economical fares and cargo rates. It was a model company which was the pride of Argentina, in relation to which all the English railway companies established in our country were, without without exception. Second-rate, the unnecessary growth in spending, largely due to the disproportionate increase in employees, the resulting decrease in returns and the rise in ticket prices made up a definite intent to sabotage. The Western Railway would quickly be discredited in the public opinion. In the years that followed, there were numerous cases of undervalued sales to British investors, including the 1,000 kilometers long Andean Railway, which provoked much anti-British sentiment in the country. By 1910, the network had been monopolized by British companies, owned by large finance firms such as J.S. Morgan and Ampco in London. Nevertheless, major development of the Argentine rail network occurred up to this period, and the Argentine state also played a large role, financing Ferrocarriles to Fomento in rural areas not attractive to private interests, while the Argentine State Railway had a 9,690 kilometers network. By 1914, the Argentine rail network attained significant growth, having added 30,000 kilometers to the network between 1895 and 1914, which positioned the country as having the 10th largest rail network in the world in that year, at a point where the country had the 10th highest per capita GDP in the world. Its expansion accelerated greatly due to the need for the transport of agricultural products and cattle in Buenos Aires province. The rail network converged on the city of Buenos Aires and was a key component in the development of the Argentine economy as it rose to be a leading export country. However, with the advent of the First World War, then subsequently the Wall Street crash and Great Depression, the rail network of the country experienced a much lower rate of growth after this period and had mostly ground to a halt by the beginning of the Second World War. Nationalization. By the end of the Second World War, the United Kingdom owed Argentina $2 billion after the country had filled the gaps in food shortages during the war effort. Following what was then a worldwide trend, the private companies were nationalized by the government of Juan Perón, beginning in 1946 with the French railways and then purchasing the British railways after an agreement was signed cancelling the British debt in 1947. Perón later claimed in an interview that the British envoys had offered him a bribe of $100 million if the state paid an extra $6 billion for the railways on top of the debt cancellation. Ferrocarriles Argentinos divisions. After the 1948 nationalization, the 47,000 kilometers long Argentine railway network was separated into 6 divisions managed by state-owned company Ferrocarriles Argentinos. Of the 20 railways incorporated into Ferrocarriles Argentinos, 7 were Argentine, 10 were British and 3 were French. Prior to nationalization, they were grouped together by track gauge and location and named after important figures in Argentine history. Maps of those division companies were as follows. Soon after the reorganization, Perón turned it into a political matter, with the nationalization becoming a symbol of national autonomy and independence from foreign powers rather than an administrative change, and is still to this day regarded by justicialists as a move against neo-imperialism. Although for many years the state-owned railways were able to provide a good standard of passenger and freight service, over the years the changing politics of Argentina began to take its toll. By the 1960s, the post-war economic boom had ushered in a new age of the automobile, with rail transport on its way out around the world. a trend from which Argentina was not left unscathed. Following the ousting of Perón from power, the Larkin Plan was implemented to modernize transport in the country with backing from the World Bank and intended to make investments in the country's railways. However, by 1961 its aims had changed significantly and the plan had evolved into one which prioritized automobile transportation and began lifting sections of railway, an act which was put to an end following a series of strikes by railway workers in opposition to the plan. Later governments between 1967 and 1971 then continued investing in the railways and enacted modernization plans, renewing much of the rolling stock, and the railways continued to function well. Under the military junta, the 1970s and 1980s saw a significant decline in Argentina's railways. In 1965, 25% of cargo and 18% of passengers were transported by rail, while by 1980 this figure had dropped to 8% and 7% respectively, and Ferrocarriles Argentinos was losing $1 million per day, maintaining an aging system with dwindling passenger numbers. Between 1976 and 1980, 560 stations were closed, along with 5,500 kilometers of track, while the number of employees in railway workshops alone fell from 155,000 to 97,000. By the time the country returned to democratic rule, the railways were in bad shape and the country was overwhelmed by the economic burdens and debts left over from the junta. Under this context, and with the state unable to cope with the cost of managing the railways due to a large fiscal deficit, the privatization of the network came into consideration. Privatization under the presidency of Carlos Menem, Argentina radically changed its economic policies, moving from a more import-substitution industrialization-orientated model towards neoliberal shock therapy and the Washington Consensus under the supervision of the International Monetary Fund. Much like under the classical liberalism of the late 19th and early 20th century, under these plans, Argentina would sell off most of its state assets at extremely reduced prices, among them the railways. During these reforms, between 1992 and 1995, the government decided to break up and to privatize the state-owned company Ferrocarriles Argentinos, which comprised 6 relatively independent divisions: Sarmiento, Mita, Urquiza, San Martin, Belgrano and Roca, and granted concessions to private companies for their operation through competitive bidding, while doing the same with freight services. At the start of the concessions, the railway network was quickly reduced to 1/4 of its capacity, with long-distance lines disappearing almost completely. At the same time, as more locomotives and rolling stock were needed, the private companies became increasingly reluctant to make the investment required to increase capacity, and thus service quality and passenger numbers declined. Railway privatization resulted in the loss of some 70,000 jobs in the railway sector over the years, whilst by 1998 some 793 railway stations had been closed. In addition, companies operating other transport means who had vested interests seeking the demise of the railway purchased lines for far less than the real value. Under privatization, substantial government subsidies continued in order to keep the system from collapsing, which meant that privatization would still mean the state losing money from the railways. During this period, the railways were plagued by negligence, while private operators persistently ignored warnings from inspectors whilst failing in their contractual obligations. obligations to maintain railway infrastructure. Similarly, over the years, government subsidies to the private companies increased to levels similar to the losses incurred under the state management of the railways, albeit now with a much more limited service and vastly deteriorated infrastructure. The closing of much of the rail system also led to the emptying of many rural towns dependent on the railways, creating ghost towns and therefore to a dismantling of the development that had taken place there since the arrival of trains. Argentine agriculture found itself in the difficult position of shipping its goods more inefficiently using road transport, which costs around 72% more than state-owned rail services. The economic crisis in 2001 was the final blow, and neither the private companies nor the government could provide the service required. In 2003, the new administration of President Néstor Kirchner set it as a key policy objective to revive the national rail network. Although the economic upturn saw traffic grow again, the suburban rail operators were still little more than managers of government contracts rather than true entrepreneurs. Re-nationalization in 2008. The national government formed Trenes Argentinos Operadora Ferroviaria to manage some freight and passenger lines in the country. The once tragedy of February 2012 prompted further action by the government, resulting in the revocation of the Sarmiento Line and Mitre Line concessions from Trenes to Buenos Aires in May of that year, with both lines eventually being put under the management of the state-owned SOFSE. In June 2012, the government announced that it was re-nationalising some freight railways, citing serious breaches of contract by the operators. This culminated in the nationalization of the Belgrano Cargas network, which operates on over 10,000 kilometers of meter-gauge track. This trend continued in the following years, and the government began reopening services and improving on the once private services using completely new rolling stock, including long-distance services like the one from Buenos Aires to Mar del Plata and Buenos Aires Rosario Córdoba. This newfound investment in the railways has not been limited to rolling stock, since, in many cases, the state has completely replaced, or is in the process of replacing, the existing infrastructure with continuous welded rails on concrete sleepers and undertaking other works such as renovating level crossings and building new railway bridges. The freight network has also received significant investment from China, with two investments totaling $4.8 billion made in 2013 and 2015, while from 2008 to 2014 there were many indications that the state was re-nationalizing parts of the railway and making efforts towards improving it. In 2015 it was announced that complete nationalization of the remaining lines and services were on the table after a project was put forward that would see the resurrection of Ferrocarriles Argentinos as a state-owned holding company which would incorporate SOFSE, TASL and ADIFSE. This was put into effect in April 2015 when, by overwhelming majority, the Argentine Senate passed the law which recreated Ferrocarriles Argentinos and effectively re-nationalized the country's railways, a move which saw support from all major political parties across the political spectrum. Expenditure from the railway network was set at $9 billion for 2015, while in 2016 it is expected to be $7.2 billion.